Hi, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Louisa Smith, the buying director at Book Passage. We know you have many options for how to spend your time, and we're so grateful that you've chosen to spend it with us tonight. We've been known for our author event program for decades, and when the pandemic hit, one of our greatest missions was to continue to bring great authors and readers together as much as possible. Luckily, a few of our amazing customers happen to have a business running online events, so we are so happy to have them as colleagues in this adventure. Big thank you to everybody that helps make this possible. And also, a big thank you to all of you who have purchased your copy of Vera through Book Passage. These sales allow us to continue to run our event series through these tough times. We're thrilled to let you know that Carol will be signing copies of her book for our customers. So please call or order through our website for one of these special signed copies. She also has very graciously offered to personalize this amazing book, and it couldn't be a better gift for your friends and loved ones, or for yourself, a special treat. I'm particularly excited for our event tonight, as I'm a huge fan of Carol's work and absolutely fell in love with Vera. Carol Edgarian is the author of the New York Times bestseller, 3 Stages of Amazement, and the international bestseller, Rise of the Euphrates, winner of the ANC Freedom Prize. Her articles and essays have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, NPR, and W, among many others. She's co-founder and editor of Narrative, a digital publisher of fiction, poetry, and art, and Narrative in the Schools, which provides free libraries and writing resources to teachers and students around the world. Tonight, we're here to celebrate Carol's latest book, Vera, a grand adventure set in 1906 San Francisco. And joining Carol in conversation tonight is Tobias Wolff, the award-winning author of The Barracks Thief, Old School, This Boy's Life, and In Pharaoh's Army, as well as numerous short story collections, including In the Garden of North American Martyrs, Back in the World, and Night in Question. This is going to be a truly amazing event for an incredible book. So thank you, and please join me in welcoming Carol and Tobias.
Thank you, Louisa.
Yes, thanks, Louisa.
Hey, you.
Hi, Carol. How are you, dear?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm fine. For those of you watching, Carol and I actually, this is our second conversation about a book in the last week on Zoom. And just about a week ago, we were in a group a small group talking about William Kennedy's wonderful novel, part of his Albany cycle of novels called Billy Phelan's Greatest Game. And it made me, he did, one of the things I love about that book is how he got his arms around the past, a past that he would have been a boy in, a very young boy, and could not have remembered, obviously, in the way that he remembered it, especially since so much of it took place in bars. And I was impressed with his way of evoking the past, and which brings me to some of the thoughts I have about Vera. Of course, anything written in the past tense is, in a sense, a historical novel,
Right.
but I mean, you've reached back over 100 years for this novel, literally to the 1906 earthquake. And I was just so impressed with the sense of reality that you created in your picture of San Francisco then. And obviously something in your soul was really drawn to that time, that place, as we reconstituted in our mind. What was it? How long had you been thinking about doing that, Carol? What drew you to it?
Well, San Francisco is my adopted city. It came from the East Coast, and you can't live out here and not think all the time about when the next quake would come.
Mm.
But I had been collecting books on the quake for years, not thinking I was going to necessarily do anything with them in my fiction, but just fascinated by this phenomenon that within the space of a minute, a society could be completely wiped out. Of course, there was the quake of 1906, and then there was the fire that at the end of the day, after 3 days of fire, 28,000 buildings, 500 city blocks, just gone, ashes, ashes. So this kind of played in my mind. You know how these things stick in our minds, and you don't know when you're going to do something with it. I really started conjuring the book before the 2016 election. And I was thinking I wanted to write an adventure story. I wanted to write it around a girl. I think a lot of the adventure stories we read are centered on boys and young men. And it seemed to me a moment pre the 2016 election when our society was in a precarious state, and things not only norms were collapsing, but that sense of being on the edge of all of a sudden I started thinking about what is a moment like that in history, and the quake came back to me. And of course, the more I researched the quake and realized at the same time there was this within San Francisco, there was so much corruption. The mayor of the town, Eugene Schmitz, was this violinist, a good-looking fella who wasn't against a little bit of corruption or a lot. And the city was run by a party boss named Abe Ruff, and he owned the sheriff, he owned the board of supervisors, and he owned the mayor. And Ruff and Schmitz were going to be indicted on the morning of the quake, and instead they got a reprieve. They got nature's greatest reprieve. And the arc of the book takes that corruption trial. Eventually, things catch up with them, and really, so those two things. I'm always looking for that nexus of what is political. Because you and I talk all the time about politics. We're both political junkies. That sense of what's going on in the politics, what's going on a level of, in terms of movement in society. And then finding these characters who are creating foolishness everywhere they go, but they're bent on reinvention. They're in some form or another. So all of that, it just seemed interesting. And then the deeper and deeper I went into the research, I mean, I felt like I could write 15 books about that time and about the characters of that time who in many ways were larger than life.
Well, Abe Ruff and Mayor Schmitz, as you portray him, and his daughter Eugenie, and who shows up in your novel. No, and it's an interesting choice you made, I thought, for your narrator, your main character, Vera, who bears the title of the book, to be the daughter of a prominent madam in the city. And I thought it was a choice. Well, talk about why you. I think it was strategic of you to position her in society in that way. Will you talk a bit about that?
Well, it's all about contradictions and complexity, isn't it? Because on the one level, if you are the bastard daughter of a madam, you are by definition an outsider, and you're outside society. On the other hand, the madams were some of the founders of the city. the city was founded by miners, and who serviced the miners but the madams. And I remember coming across one note that before San Francisco had proper roads and a police force, they had the Barbary Coast. It had the Barbary Coast. So that turn, that she is both the daughter of someone who is esteemed and certainly very powerful in town. Rose, who's a fictional character, is not only the proprietor of the Rose, she also has her hand in a lot of pots and knows pretty much everyone's secret, as the great madams do. But she is not raising her daughter. She puts Vera with a foster mother, essentially, sets them up in a town, in another part of the town. And the woman she chooses, Maury, has her own problems, little bit of a tippler, little bit of a gambling debt. And more to the point, she doesn't understand Vera. She doesn't understand this whip smart girl who is contrary, who is not pleasing, whose goal in life is not to marry someone who will raise her in society. I mean, she's just the opposite of all of that. And so in every way that I could think of in terms of opportunity, I wanted to put Vera on the outside and moment to moment to moment figure for herself. There's that line early on, how she was always looking for one adult who would show her how to behave. And of course, she never finds that person. She has to become that person. And, I thought that I thought it would allow me pre-quake and certainly post-quake, when she has to rely so much on her wits, not only to survive, but she really becomes responsible for a whole group of people, to have that outsider place. And literature is full of the outsider, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting you mentioned the Barbary Coast. Something that touches on San Francisco, and that it isn't anything like what you're doing. But I had a lot of fun reading Herbert Asbury's account of San Francisco at that time as well, the Barbary Coast. One of my favorite things in his book is a description of a dentist who, when the miners came out of the hills with their haul of nuggets, was famous for replacing the miners' teeth with choppers made out of their own gold. That must have been a sight. But the city was really a kind of painted lady itself, wasn't it?
It's amazing to me how the essential DNA of a city gets set right at the beginning. I mean, you think about what built San Francisco. It was this entrepreneurial, rules don't apply to us, wildly optimistic, good dose of hubris, hugely inflated pricing. I remember reading somewhere that a canvas tent in the 1800s was thousands of dollars to rent during the gold rush. I mean, just it was silly money. But all of that was at play in 1906, and all of it is at play now. And both what is the miracle of San Francisco and also the shadow.
Yeah.
The too muchness, the hubris, the inflation, and interesting to me for what we're living in now. And of course, I keep thinking about how, especially when you're writing in the distant about the distant past, you're writing it in the time that you're writing it. In my case, all through pre-election and Trump. But I finished the book in January of 2020, pre-pandemic, and had no idea that it would be read in this moment of catastrophe, this moment of disaster and reckoning. And it's so interesting because, of course, readers find books within the context of their lives, right?
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
and interesting. I thought a lot about in terms of the back half of the book, post-quake, how if there is a moment in a disaster, see if you go with me on this. There's a moment post something so epic like a quake and a fire, where before society can really sort of assert itself again and can really screw down everything, there's a moment for opportunity for reinvention, for those who have been labeled misfit or outcast or marginalized. There's a moment where in surviving and there are certainly scenes in the book of this, the wealthy folk are standing next to refugees in food lines. And there is that moment of recalibration of what do we actually believe? Who are we, and what is the essential human connection between us? And that's interesting to me.
It is. And you show as well in your novel how perhaps some of the most unexpected people rise to the occasion and
Right.
make themselves available to others, try to reconstitute this community that's been shattered by this cataclysm. But it wasn't it? I mean, I've seen, there's those old films of San Francisco after the fire, after the earthquake and fire, and it looks like Berlin after World War II. I mean,
It sure does.
there's
That
not a lot standing.
No, there's that amazing film that was shot literally days before the quake of the journey down Market Street. And miraculously, the folks who shot it sent the film to New York. Literally, I think it was a day before the quake. Otherwise, we would have lost it. But you can see how amazing, this vibrant city was. And then someone shot the same footage post-quake, and you can just see, yeah, to your point, absolutely, like a bomb had gone off. And when that happens, Vera has to figure out how to survive. And I think that kind of sense of what one's resiliency gets tested. And, of course, people who she thought were her enemies or her rivals. I mean, I'm thinking of Tan, who for me was one of the characters who kept surprising me and kept growing. And here's a guy for readers who are new to the novel. Here's a man who is elegant. He is a butler. He is a really fine cook. He knows wines. He's Rose's major domo. He has worked, of course, at the Rose, but he works in the house now. And one of the things he has to do once a week is go down the hill to Vera's house, where they're bad housekeepers and lousy. Maury's a lousy cook, and he thinks the whole setup with Vera is a pain, and he is someone who loves and lives for his daughter. Now the thing is, he's a Chinese servant in 1906, and because because of that, he has to live in a basement on a dirt floor with cast-off furniture and no belongings, and essentially, other than his uniform, rags. And of course, when the quake happens, one of the first things those who ran the town did. Chinatown burned, and they corralled the Chinese and put them in an encampment in the Presidio. And so Tan returns. Vera and Tan come together in Rose's house, and I don't want to give away the plot here, but there's a kind of reckoning among rivals, and bit by bit they show themselves to be much more than rivals, to actually be partners and even family. And that's interesting to me, when characters just keep, in their wrong rightness, in their complexity, they actually surprise you, even though you're the one writing them. They I don't know, do you find that sometimes that they just they're more and they're more interesting? Who gets more interesting as you write them, and who recedes?
I live for those moments as a writer when somebody that I'm making out of words suddenly surprises me. Something happens, some possibility opens up that obviously it's coming from me. Where else could it be coming from? But I'm surprising myself, I guess, in some way. And Wallace Stevens has a wonderful line. He said, "No surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader."
Yeah.
And if we write according to bring the thing in just exactly as we had imagined it, it's generally not probably going to be as interesting,
Well, it's too
at
neat.
least to us. And it's too. The problem would be, yes, that it would be. William Gass has a description somewhere of a story ending in a predictable way. He said, like the sound of a cheap lock snapping home, and you don't want that. And so you pray for exactly those moments you're talking about, when things seem to indeed take on a life of their own. Yeah, we do live for that.
Yeah.
Keep loose hands on the reins. When I understand why you would have been drawn to that period and wanted to bring that to life so much, and probably a lot of the joys in doing that. What were some of the challenges that you had? I mean, what stumped you? What were things you had to get around or get over in writing the book?
Well, I think, you research, and there is that Curious George aspect of just going down the rabbit hole of learning about a new. I think first you have to go somewhere that you're interested in, right? But there comes that moment where you really have to forget the research. You have to. You can't have it bind you so that it feels to the reader. And I hope I achieve this. That you don't want it to feel to the reader like someone's giving you a textbook. It's got to be real enough, but it's also got to be human. It's got to be, we can talk on and on about all the changes since 1906, but the bottom line is the human animal hasn't changed.
Yeah.
So, and that's the driver. That desire, that vulnerability is what's got to drive the story. So I found, where to position the quake, where to position it so that you have enough sense of what happened before. I love writing. I love reading. As a reader, I love to go places that I normally can't go, to fly on magic carpets. So one of the things that, I don't know if it was a challenge, but it was interesting for me, is Caruso came to sing the night before the quake. And, this was a big deal in San Francisco, because San Francisco was really still, kind of rough and tumble. And you know, the biggest celebrity in town was Miss Flora, the roller derby queen. So society, San Francisco, was really like, wow, we're getting Caruso. This is an amazing thing. So what I loved was, how can I get Caruso on the page? Because the more I read about it, Caruso was his own story. Mount Vesuvius had erupted a few weeks before. He was in shock about that. He was in New York. He missed his kids and his wife. He got on a train. It's a 10-day train ride to head west, and he couldn't sleep. And he decided he was going to be murdered in San Francisco. San Francisco was a murderous town, and he was frightened. So he got his valet to get off the train and buy him a gun. And I read that little tidbit and I thought, okay, what am I going to do with that gun? Like, that is just too good to waste. So of course, like, I had to create a scene where Caruso, you know, you posit the gun's got to do something in the story, right? But also, you know, the poor guy, he performs as Don Jose and Carmen. He rapturous applause, and 5 o'clock in the morning the next day, he gets the quake, and he's in the Palace Hotel. He's in his suite, and you know, all the walls start moving. And what does he do? He ends up, you know, he's in his bathrobe out on the street. There are dead steer, there are dead horses, there are people moaning. And Caruso wants his valet to go up and down the stairs and bring down his trunks. He doesn't want, and he had 50 some odd trunks. The poor, I keep thinking, you know, the valet, are you kidding me? You know, he wants his trunks. And he walked around the town. He went and got himself breakfast. And there's a firsthand account of Caruso. And let me tell you, he never came to San Francisco again. That was it. He got out one of the last ferries. But just all those moments, like the judgment of if you are awakened, it's pre-dawn, you're awakened and you get out of your house, and the house may have like jumped off its foundation. And you've got to decide in those moments, what are you going to go back in and get? Like, once everybody's okay, what do you take out of the house? Mm-hmm. And you're there in the street, and you've got your people, and maybe somebody's wounded and someone's died in the next house next door. And just over the hillside, you see the first smoke, you see the fire. And all those moments, like, what are the human judgments? What are the judgments we're making today in this time of what is important? What do we value? The people we value, you know, that there's been a whole recalibration. That was interesting moment to really think about. I mean, I think another thing that really struck me, there were so many photographs of that day. Gintha and a number of other photographers grabbed their cameras and just went around the city and shot people as they were gathering their trunks and whatever. And there were all these photographs of families on the hillsides picnicking or standing there while the smoke was just, you know, literally the fire was blocks away. And I thought a lot about that, Toby. I thought, you know, were they so shocked from having lived through the quake, and the aftershocks kept coming? So it's not like it's a one-time event. You're steeled for the next thing. Are you exhausted? Are you shell-shocked? What happens? What happens to you? That's really, it's interesting to me. And I think we make those decisions every day in our lives, right? What is important? Who is important?
Well, I hope not, but we may be put to that very test if the earth that we are living on decides to shrug again. And
How often do you think about that?
not very often, because I feel so helpless in the face of the fact. I mean, we do what we can to prepare for it. We all have our little kits and everything. Uh, but no, I mean, as Leonard Cohen says, we are so lightly here. And uh, and to see what happened then, uh, and to know that it could happen again for all our engineering marvels and our attempts to retrofit our brick houses. And I mean, we'll see. I hope, I fervently pray it does not happen. But I mean, we may find your book very instructive at some point.
Well, there was that woman, a mother in Hayes Valley, whose house was quite, Hayes Valley being on the flats, took it quite hard. And her chimney broke in half. And she had young kids, and the sun is coming up. She doesn't know where they're going to go, where the next meal is. So what does she do? She makes them breakfast in the broken chimney. And the broken chimney sets off, combusts. And that is known as the ham and eggs fire. It burned a huge part of town. I mean, in all, there were over 50 fires. Yeah. Human folly. I'm like you, fascinated by human folly and just there's a line in the book: catastrophe for many is an opportunity for some. And that is true. And also I was thinking a lot about the contradictions, and the contradiction in the sense of honor among thieves, because of course every character, including Vera in the book, is a thief. And
yeah, certainly the mayor.
Certainly the mayor.
And Ruth.
Yeah, they all are. They all are. There is thieving aplenty, and they are. If they're not stealing money, they're stealing love. They're stealing. They're stealing. They're stealing all kinds of things. Mm-hmm. Horses.
Yeah. Something kind of almost charmingly bald-faced about it too in this city, and Vera is so well situated. I mean, her mother is distant in a sense. The city itself, a kind of painted lady like her mother, becomes her mother. I mean, she's in the city. She seeks her reassurance from the city. She's out and about.
Yeah.
Great pair of eyes in the city, and you've given her a great voice as well.
Thank you. She loves the city. You get that early on. The city, the city very much, when you're homeless or home is questioned, everything around you takes on a kind of magnitude of importance and equal fragility in this case. Watching the city try to recover, try to regain its footing. I mean, I think about 250,000 people homeless at that time. And there were naval boats that came in that took a lot of people offshore. But there were many, 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 many people who were just homeless. And how do you get food? How do you get water? All the water mains burst, all the gas lines burst. Very basic things. How do you pull it together? There were soldiers just patrolling the streets, and anyone looting, and of course there was a lot of looting. Anyone looting could be shot without question. and how and what reasserts itself is really interesting to me.
Having been so immersed in this experience as you've been for a few years now, I mean, how does that affect your day-to-day relationship with the city? Do you think about it much? Do you have moments where, you fasten your hand upon your heart with the thought of it?
I'm all the time waiting for the next one. I mean, I lived through Loma Prieta, and we used to get, I shouldn't even say this, it's inviting the wrath of the gods, but we used to get a lot more little shakers in the many years I've been out here. And yeah, I mean, while writing this, I drove everybody in the house crazy with, here it comes, here, do we have enough water? Do we have enough canned goods? Do we have enough? But I also, Toby, this is a moment where San Francisco is really, I think it's lost some of its heart. It's lost some of its there's the homeless problem, the problem of young people not able to afford to live here anymore. Teachers having to move out, hours out of the city because they can't afford an apartment, a studio apartment. I mean, we're in this moment where the city has to, the problems seem vast. And of course, the problems in our country right now seem vast, and are in some ways impossible. And it's a moment when we're going to have to figure this out bit by bit. I mean, I think, I was walking down the street the other day, and everybody, thank goodness, was wearing a mask. And I thought, look at that, like how much we've shifted in the last year. I mean, here we are, the first week of March. It's a year. I think next week marks the year since we've been sheltering in place. And coming out of this, are there going to be lessons learned, or are we going to just go back to same old, same old?
Well, what would be the lesson we would learn?
What do you think? I think a recalibration and maybe letting go of more is more, and greater equality. I mean, more voices at the table. The hubris. Is this going to have been our lesson? Our lesson that are we Rome? Are we the end, or is this a new beginning? So much I think about in times. You brought up World War II. I mean, stories come out of these times, right? Great stories come out of these times. Great art, and is it going to show us the way? It's interesting.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, if it has certainly revealed to us, this pandemic, the disunity of the fragility of our society, the foolishness, and I mean, this whole crazy business today of governors in Texas and Mississippi taking the very steps that are likely to make things worse. And that's why I asked, what have we learned? I worry that we don't learn, and just pretend that things that we can go on as before without reflecting on what's happened and thinking of ways to make things better, not just for ourselves, but obviously for the whole community that we live in. And I mean, that's one of the nice, or the kind of, for me, is the way in which, and in fact, this did happen, people did come together and try to help each other and feed each other and house each other, and comfort each other. I mean, it's a shame that it took such a cataclysm to make that happen. Our cataclysm has been so slowly and gradually unfolding that we haven't been galvanized like that, though we should be.
Well,
Anyway.
I think what Vera learns, and I think to your point, she begins as an outsider. So she, the quake in that way doesn't change her essentially who she is. But because she's an outsider, and because she's independent in her thought, which was, somewhat profoundly radical in 1906, perhaps still is. She doesn't judge people by their position, particularly because so many of the folks in high position got there through illegal means. But that apart, she judges people by their real character, and do they show up? And that, when society has collapsed, who and what rises. And I think at bottom, I feel this in my own life, maybe because of where I come from, and this very well. My parents were both first generation Americans, and, my father's family really had to work out, and in many ways didn't work out, but were traumatized by the Armenian genocide. And on my mother's side, they were alcoholics. They came against their will. The matriarch of that family made them come to America during Prohibition, believing that you couldn't get booze and therefore their alcoholism would be cured. Complete folly. In Connecticut, a factory worker in the 1920s could get plenty of booze. And so my mother, my mother was born in 1935. When she was 5 in 1940, the situation in her house was so bad that the state took her out of her home and put her in an orphanage. And you know this, we've talked about it. And she was institutionalized from the age of 5 to 18. So on both sides, and maybe this is at the bottom of what I'm working out in fiction, is this notion of displacement, this notion of where is home and who are your people, who can you count on? But I think displacement is very much, it's at the bottom of so many American stories. And it's at the bottom of so much of what is happening right now in our country, that feeling of having been uprooted, having been torn from something, or that expectations of what should be life have been taken away from you. And so then, you're so much more susceptible to what's coming at you and to misinformation. Anyway, I think bottom, and I know in your amazing work, which I'm a huge fan of. I mean, I think what we're always trying to get after is like, what makes people go? What makes them tick? What makes them, when they come together, what happens? And they're never in the same moment. They're never in the same place at the same time. They want different things all the time. And you put them in sort of these extreme situations, like a quake, like a disaster, and they show themselves, right?
Mm-hmm. And and they show themselves in their dailiness too.
In
Uh,
their dailiness. Yeah.
uh, and it was funny. I did remember you're telling me about your mother being farmed out when she was young. And I couldn't help remembering that, looking at Vera's situation, Rose farming her out to Elsa, or Mori as they call her. And uh, it's interesting how one's one's personal sense of the past, one's finds a form that is not strictly autobiographical
No,
or
no.
biographical in the case of your mother, but uh, these veiled ways in which we deal with the past and try to understand it through fiction. I thought, I couldn't help thinking of that when I was encountering Vera in that situation. Yeah. Uh,
Yeah, and she's scrappy. She was really, I mean, when you said about, what's the challenge of writing historical fiction, to your point, there has to be that dailiness versus, the marquee, oh, this happened in, June of 1906.
right.
But also, really fun to write outside yourself. I'm always fascinated when people, when readers ask, who's the character most like you? And, they're all a part of you. They're all, particularly the ones who commit, who commit foolish acts, or in Vera's case, that to be contrary. That was really fun to write. It was fun to take a young girl who goes against expectations, who is standing in a room with her mother at last, and wants so badly to walk the 10 steps toward her and can't move, can't her feet are like lead pipes. She wants something so badly she can't go toward it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And all those ways in which we're just vulnerable, we're just human.
Yeah. Well, we've talked so much about I mean, the large events of the novel, the earthquake, the fire, the cataclysm that follows, and people. But so it sounds grave, but the novel actually doesn't have that effect. There's a lightness to it, and also some pretty funny. It's pretty funny in parts.
Good.
Um, you know, with Vera's sister by adoption, Pi, kind of haggling with a neighbor over how much she's going to take for a hat, and also the obsession with Rose's jewels, right? And what's going to happen with those? There are all these leitmotifs, and that have a kind of underlie of comedy to them almost in this. And we do, even in these big moments, our attention goes to things that are, in comparison, little, trivial, but they are the things that make up our mental furniture, our desires. And I thought you really captured that beautifully.
Oh, thank you. I really wanted to write it as an adventure. I wanted it to be, one of my favorite comments from a fellow writer, Jenny Egan, said, this was a romp. She said, I really thought it was a romp. And that I loved hearing, because that's exactly what I wanted. Vera is spare. She is quick. And so her voice, she moves quickly. She moves at the tempo of her memory, at the tempo of her telling, but she also has that kind of impatient irreverence. that I wanted to get across. It is a romp. It is a romp. And even though, you know, and we see this in our own lives, we're living in a pandemic, but that doesn't mean every moment is grave or serious. In fact, like, don't we cleave to the moments when there's levity, when you can just forget, or you can be in a moment of standing, you know, I had fun writing a moment when the mayor, I mean, what Schmitz did, which was really smart, was he immediately assembled what was called the Committee of 50. And the 50 guys he assembled, all leaders of town, he made sure all his enemies were in that committee. So they had to work with him, whether they wanted to or not. And there they are, you know, and they have to, the day after the quake, they have to move from place to place to place because the fire keeps coming. So they have to keep relocating. And finally, he tries to leave to go get some food at home, and they all follow him because they're hungry and they want some beer. And there's his wife, like, what the hell am I going to do with these people? I mean, you know, I have one wee ham. And Vera says, well, slice it really thin. And she's standing looking at these guys. And I mean, you know, Hearst is in the room, and, you know, all these, you know, Titans are in the room. And Vera's thinking, what is that smell? You know, what, and, you know, and of course it's like sweat and ash but she's like looking at them, but that's not just what she's thinking. You know, we all work on so many channels, and in her thinking, she's thinking, what is that smell? It's like, you know, and meanwhile, you know, the maid is trying to stretch a ham. I mean,
yeah. Miracle of the loaves and the fishes.
Well, I thought of that, the loaves and the fishes. We have our own story about which we
yeah, we do. Oh, goodness.
Oh, hi, Louisa.
Hi,
Well,
wow.
You've made a world here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Such a wonderful conversation. And I can't tell you, whenever I listen to Carol speak, I take lots of notes because she just says things that are like, oh, yes. Things that took me back to reading this book. I've read this book 3 times now. And every time I find something in it, which is sort of like the city itself, you know, the layers, you know, the base, what it was built on, and then all this other stuff. And I keep discovering things. The way that you cracked open the city, you know, with this book, and really brought to life a time that we all know but didn't know. In a way, it was such a big event that we've been distracted by the event itself and lost sight of the people that we're living it. I just think you did a beautiful job in bringing that world to life. And in particular, there's something you said tonight that really struck me. You quoted the book and you said, catastrophe for the many is opportunity for the few. And you also said, I really do take notes, look at this. When society collapses, who or what rises? And here you've created this character in Vera, who's sort of outside of society, bucks against convention, refuses to be forced into a box. And she is exactly who we need at this time. I mean, and in a way, we needed her, a book about someone like her to connect us to this time, because she could connect between so many different parts of this city. I mean, it's a very complex city. There's all these different groups, and only somebody that didn't fit well within one of those groups could connect between them. And I don't know if I can ask a question. Is that something you thought of, or is that something that grew out of when you were writing about her?
Yeah, I did think a lot about that. And I don't think it's particular to San Francisco. I think you know, whether it's Vera or Ten or some of the sex workers, Capability and Valentine, who of course are homeless and end up finding not just shelter, but a home with Vera, and how how society puts everyone in a box of expectation. You are a girl in 1906. You are therefore going to be this. You are going to care about this. You are someone, whatever that box is. And in my mind, I had this image of the quake flattening those box, like what happens if we get rid of the constructs, and who shows up, who proves themselves to be, and worthy is not the right, because there's a judgment in that, but how do we prove ourselves to one another? How do we come together? Vera really was in many ways without family, and the quake, that happened before the quake. But the quake gives reason to her actually finding the real family, the real people she's with. And I just think that notion of reinvention is an American notion, but it's a moment we're in right now. I don't know. Toby's less optimistic, and maybe that's true, but I also think some amazing things have happened in the last year with us, with reckoning. And I'm not sure, we can look at events that led to it, but I'm not sure if we were in a global way in this moment of fragility, I'm not sure things would have moved and in quite the same way. And the question that remains is what happens now? And to your point, Texas is a real slide backwards. We'll see.
Yes, it is. But think of within this year, there are human ingenuity and imagination has produced 3 life-saving vaccines too. I don't see only hopelessness.
I know you don't. I know you don't.
But it does set me back sometimes how foolish we can be.
But in part, Toby, you feel that because your heart is so open, and that's the thing. It's like, how do we keep our hearts open to, how do we stay curious and open to the surprises, right? And I hope in the book that, that's one thing about writing. That's one thing that Vera taught me, because despite everything, she stays very curious and very open. And that was a gift to me as I was writing it.
Well, the book is a gift to all of us. This time that you've spent with us is a gift to all of us. I would say that while we would love to have you back in the store, that is what we enjoy most, is being together and celebrating. One of the gifts has been that we're now doing this virtually, and it isn't just the people that live here that get to be with you tonight. It's people from across the world. We get letters from people in Afghanistan who watch our videos. So it's like you said, there are gifts here as well. And so appreciate the time you spent with us tonight. Everybody who's watching, thank you. And this book is really something special. I hope that you all will enjoy Vera as much as I have. Thank you so much, Carol. Thank you, Toby.
Thank you, Louisa. Thank you, Toby. Thank you, everyone.
Have a wonderful night.